So welcome everybody. I'm here with Laurent Guillenot. He's a writer, he's a researcher, he's an analyst, he's a historian, I guess you could say. But he's got a lot of really interesting ideas. I'm a big fan of his work. I read Yahweh to Zion, From Yahweh to Zion, and it really explained a lot of things to me that just key missing pieces that for some reason or another, probably because of emotional type reasons or, you know, I think it will become clear as we get into this. It's a very controversial book. A lot of his stuff is very controversial, but it's also extremely enlightening in the sense that if you can accept some of the points that Mr. Guillenot is making, a lot of things become very clear where before it was opaque. Let's just put it that way. Today, I was really hoping to ask Mr. Guillenot's opinions and his take on several key questions. So the first one would probably be about just how he came about to his understanding of the Yahweh question, I guess we could say. Secondly, I'd like to ask him his opinions on Marcionism, which he has referenced several times in his articles, and which I've taken a personal interest in. And well, I think that's enough for now. I don't know. I hand it over to you, Mr. Guillenot. Thank you so much for talking to me. Can we start with how you got into this? I know you mentioned 9/11 research, but and you had a background in religion, or you'd read about this before, but something made you start asking questions about who exactly is this Yahweh and why is he important for understanding, modern politics and all that. So go
Okay.
for it.
Well, thank you, Rolo, for inviting me. And your questions are very exciting, and they are the most important questions about Yahweh. Yeah, how did I end up, reading again the Bible and try to understand, and why I felt it's important to understand this whole background of the Jewish tradition. Why is it important to understand geopolitics of today? Well, for me, it all started with 9/11. When I discovered it was about 12 years ago. That was a time when it was very easy to find controversial information on 9/11. You just had to Google, 9/11, and you would end up watching the film Loose Change and all these kind of things. So now it's a little bit more difficult. But anyway, at that time, everything changed for me, my whole worldview, my whole view of America, of the world. And so, that was the beginning of the path. And then quite quickly, actually, I realized the connection between 9/11 and the neoconservatives. And then I started to try to understand who were the neoconservatives, and then it's very easy to understand that basically they are what I would say crypto-Zionist. I quickly understood that their whole project is not for the sake of American imperialism. In fact, they don't really care about America's future. They don't really care about American values. What they wanted is to draw America into the Middle East against the Arab world, and that's what they did through 9/11, through the false flag attack of 9/11, by creating this bogeyman of Osama bin Laden and so on. Anyway, I don't need to get into detail. I suppose most people who are listening know the story. So, from that point, I felt it's really important to understand what is their project, where are they going, what do they want? And then as I studied the history of Zionism, I became quite convinced that Zionism is biblical. Fundamentally, Zionism is a political project that is written in the Bible. And the Zionist, and I think the best example would be David Ben-Gurion, who was not a religious person, but he was very biblical all the same. So when I say Zionism is biblical, people would answer, well, no, because Zionists are not religious people. Theodor Herzl was not a religious person, but yeah, that's true. But the Bible is not only a religious book. For Israelis in general, the Bible is a story of the Jewish people. It's not only, of course, there is this character Yahweh at the center of the Bible, but Yahweh, for many Jews, he's just like a personification of the Jewish people. Ben Gurion would say things like that. He would say Yahweh is just, like the soul or the collective soul of the Jewish people. So they have all kinds of ways to be inspired by the Bible without taking, it as a religious revelation from God or whatever. So, David Ben Gurion, for example, would say, well, it's not God who chose the Jewish people, it's the Jewish people who chose God or who chose themselves, or, So anyway, for the Zionists, it doesn't really matter if they're religious or not. And Christians misunderstand this point because they don't understand Jewish religion. Jewish religion is not necessarily religious, in a sense. It's
well, but I just had this amazing interview with this other guy, and of course he's into like mysticism and stuff. Maybe you know him, Tom Montauk. I love his stuff. I mean, he talks about similar. Anyways, we got into Yahweh. I don't know how it came up, but I guess if you talk about anything nowadays, you have to you have to bring up Yahweh if you're trying to understand anything. And so we're talking about this, and he says, well, what it seems to me is that Yahweh is an egregor, which is this occult concept, which is exactly what Ben Gurion seems to be saying.
Basically,
it's like it's like a thought form that you invest, I guess, energy into and emotion and thought into. And so in a weird way, it's like you said, who created who? Did Yahweh create the Jews, or did the Jews create Yahweh, or is it like some sort of chicken or the egg type thing?
exactly.
I don't have an answer to that, but I think that's fascinating and this is in your book, and it's in the Bible, this like concept of that they're sort of, it's also in their mystical system in Kabbalah. I don't know if you've mentioned that before, but this idea that they kind of return to this Yahweh like state where they're like undistinguished, they're kind of in the soup, and then they're created, and then they live as differentiated individuals as Jews, and then they kind of, after they die, they go back to Yahweh, and the link between them is their blood.
Okay.
And you're right. Christians don't understand this?
No, but even more simply than that, what you said is absolutely true. Many Jews think like that. Many intellectual Jews, if they are a little bit mystical, they would, think like that. And the Kabbalah itself, would teach that Jews created God in some way and continue to create God in some way. But even if you even if you don't get into that kind of mystical thinking, which is interesting, but if you just read the Bible itself, it's very clear that Yahweh is originally just the God of the Jews, the God of Israel. It's a national God. It's a very aggressive, cruel, and it's the jealous God of Israel who hates all other gods, So the point is that for most Jews, intellectual Jews who, think about it deeply, basically, Yahweh is the God of Israel, who happened to be also the God of mankind, of who pretended to at some point, who was transformed into the creator of the universe. So historically, Yahweh is originally a national God, and then at some point, and we can actually know at what point in history, he was transformed into, he claimed to be the God of the universe, and the Gentiles were somehow convinced that this God of Israel is in fact the creator of the universe, And today we read in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, that God, created the universe, and then he chose the Jewish people. But in fact, if you study the history of how the Bible was written, the book of Genesis was probably the last book of the Pentateuch. So in fact, it's the opposite way. It's the God of Israel. Every nation had their God. So Israel had their own God, who was very, very particular. And at some point, they managed to convince, part of mankind that this was the God of the creator of the universe. So many Jews would understand this. So they think, well, we as a nation, we have our God, like every other nations had their gods in the past. And we are so smart that we convince the whole world that our God was the creator of the universe. And therefore we are chosen not by our national God, which, would be normal, but we are chosen by the creator of the universe. So this is the big trick, and I think many Jews are quite proud of having managed to convince half of mankind, if you include Christians and Muslims, I think that pretty much half of mankind are convinced that Yahweh is the creator of the universe. And so you have Zionism is basically a national project, but which has an incredible power to move forward in the world, because most people believe that at some point in history God chose the Jews, even though
Right. You had
Christians.
an article titled "Your God is our God, but He loves us more," or something like that. But He chose us.
Yeah, that's the title of
You
one of my book. Yeah, I
yeah,
exactly.
yeah, yeah.
That summarize it. Yes, our God is
That's
our God is your God too. So because we convinced you that our God is also your God, but anyway, He chose us. And
right,
even
right.
though Christians would say, yeah, well, He chose you, but you messed up, so He gave up on you, that doesn't make any sense. God never changed His mind. For Jews know that it doesn't make
Well, it
any
doesn't
sense.
even make sense in the context of Christianity because there are direct quotes that, again, the Jews themselves wrote, like in the Gospels, where it says that that the gifts of Yahweh are not revoked. That like even if Paul, for example, was talking about how we have to reject the what was it, the curse of Moses or the yoke of Moses, and he's talking about how we need to move past that, and so he's like the creator of Christianity as we know it. But they kind of clamped down on that and said, yeah, well, Paul maybe said some things, but no, like no, we're not going to go that far.
Yeah.
There's so much you said. I want to. There's so much you said, and there's so many questions I've been burning to ask you.
Yeah,
I was
if you allow me, just to finish on the Yahweh thing, because
Go ahead.
finally your question was the point was how does it connect, how Zionism connects to Yahwism. Well, the point is that in the Bible, if you read the Bible at the basic level, not metaphorically or whatever, but there is a project for the Jews to rule the world.
Yes.
Israel, the Jewish people, are destined to rule over nations and to destroy the nations that don't want to be ruled by Israel. That's black and white. It's written in Deuteronomy. It's written all over the place in the biblical books. So this is, in fact, I realized the real project of Zionism. Zionism is not a nationalism in the traditional sense of 19th century, nationalism. Zionism is really a project to realize the destiny of Israel. And the destiny of Israel, as written in the Bible, is to rule the world. That's why we don't understand Zionism if we just think, oh, Jewish people, they just want to be a nation like all other nations. They can never be a nation like all other nations, because they have this very special destiny, which they feel very, very strongly, the destiny to rule the world and ultimately to set up a world government in Jerusalem, basically.
Yeah. Well, look, I again, I have so many questions, but we're gonna have to start somewhere. And I really wanted to ask you: Have you? So I agree with you, and Christians do not understand this. They think that it's about a universal God, the Bible, that is. But at some point, a bait and switch occurred, and we got a national God. But what kind of God is Yahweh? I've heard lots of different comparisons. Because different cultures have had similar pantheons, and you even get some of that in the Bible with Deuteronomy, and where you have like El and his pantheon, and he's saying like, okay, what was it? I think it was to Judah. He said, Yahweh, you will have the people of Judah, and so he's sort of like handing out different nations. It's like something from Lord of the Rings, where the dwarves have their gods and the elves have their god, and the Jews have. But I heard Yahweh compared to Zeus, that he's like a kind of storm god. He's like a storm battle evil creator type deity. I've heard him compared to the Egyptian god of chaos and foreigners. I think Seth is his name. The Romans, when they stormed the temple on 2 occasions, although this could have been a duplication, but at least once we know, they found some donkey-headed deity, and this donkey imagery seems to come up quite a bit. It's like an insult hurled by Greeks and Romans at the Jews of the time that they worship a donkey deity. So, and then I've heard the comparison from Roman historians who compare Yahweh to a local version of Dionysius, a kind of dark, and Dionysius is also a foreign god, and it's like a dark god of like materiality, I guess you could say, the flip side of Apollo. So what do you think? Is it Zeus? Is it Dionysius? Is it Seth? Any thoughts on
Well,
that? Is it?
yeah, well, I think, it's many things for many different people. And since the Bible is a collection of books, every book would have a, but, one thing I could say is if you read the story in Genesis and in Exodus, especially, what you see is Moses, a guy who escaped from Egypt because he murdered one Egyptian. So he's a murderer on the run. He finds himself in Arabia somewhere, in the Sinai, but in the Sinai, it's in fact not in what we call today the Sinai. It appears to be more in northwest Arabia. And there he marries the daughter of a priest of the god of the Midianites, the Arabian people there. Okay, and then this guy tells him, kind of Moses herds the goats of his father-in-law and ends up at the foot of a mountain, and there he hears Yahweh. He meets a God who tells him, "Hi, my name is Yahweh." Okay, your name is Yahweh. Yeah, okay, you're the God of Israel. Yeah, I'm the God of it. I'm the God of your ancestors. So this is kind of, and then he climbs on top of the mountain, which seems to be a volcano. If you read the description, this mountain spits fires and trembles and etc. So you basically what you have here is Moses meeting a God who lives in a volcano and who speaks to him. Nobody else but him hears what he says, and then he comes down to the mountain and he tells what Yahweh told him. Yahweh told him, let's go and conquer Jerusalem. Let's go and conquer Syria. Let's go and get a piece of the Fertile Crescent, because Arabs from Arabia have always been looking at this Fertile Crescent and trying to get a piece of it. So, this is what we can, one answer to your question is, well, who is Yahweh? He's just a small demon living in a volcano, that's all. And then in order to bring him to Jerusalem, they have to put him in a box. They have to put Yahweh in a box and then build a tent for him and so on. That's the level, of who Yahweh is. If you read the story, that's all there is, And then at some point, as I said, how did this little volcanic god become the creator of the universe? Well, that's the whole trick, That's the whole thing. Then they wrote the book of Genesis to explain, well, this Yahweh who lived in the volcano happened to have created the universe before.
Well, let's get into that.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, just another answer that has nothing to do with, which I found interesting, is that Greeks and Romans at the turn of the millennium, they had stories about who is Yahweh, which God do the Jews worship, and then Plutarch has a story that actually the Jews worship Set. And Set is the brother of Osiris and the murderer of Osiris. So he's for the Egyptians, he's the evil god. That's kind of interesting because there is a whole tradition of Egyptian tradition that according to which, in fact, the Jews are worshipping the evil god, Set, who is the murderer of Osiris and who is
He's the god of chaos and foreigners and strife.
God of lies, a god of exactly.
Which kind of fits.
It kind of fits, but that's probably just an Egyptian way to make sense of the Jewish people. Why are the Jewish people so antisocial? Why do they hate all the gods? Egyptians could not understand a god who hates all other gods, because in the Egyptian tradition, the gods live in harmony. And because they live in harmony, then the cosmos is harmonious. And if you have one god who hates all of the gods, then that's evil by definition, And so they made sense of the Jewish Jewish hostility to all other religions, but theirs, they made sense of that by thinking, well, in fact, they are worshiping Set, because Set is the god who was excluded. He was banned by all the other gods. He's the god who cannot live socially with all other gods, which was an interesting way to make sense of who is Yahweh, in fact.
Yeah, and he's also if you look at how he's depicted, it looks somewhat like a donkey, but not quite. It looks like some kind of chimera type thing, and maybe that's the donkey connection that the Romans then observed upon sacking the temple.
Exactly, because the donkey, all Egyptian gods have an animal symbolic animal. So a set animal was a donkey. That's where it comes from.
Right, that might be the Set connection more. But since you brought up Egypt, I think that's very key to understanding this. Have you heard of an amateur historian? I mean, I don't mean he's like not good. I'm saying he's independent. That's a better word. Yeah, an independent historian named Russell Gemirkin, who states that basically the Old Testament is not as old as the Jews claim it is, and that there's very good evidence for it being written in the 2nd century BC, and that the Septuagint, which was the 70 or the 72, who came to Alexandria to transcribe their people's traditions, what they did was they took an account of an older Egyptian called Manetho, and Manetho had a very anti-Jewish account of a lot of the events that occurred in the Bible, especially around Exodus. And what they did is basically write correcting the record, a polemic against Manetho, which came to be known as the Torah. And so Gemirkin's thesis is really interesting because he says that they copied from Plato. And this is really key to understanding what the Bible is, because Plato talks about this plan to create this sort of global theocratic communist dictatorship in the Republic, and they were very aware of Plato's work and the work of the Greeks, and so they took a lot of these ideas. And so one of the main ideas of Plato is this idea that there has to be a good creator God, one God who's the good God, who is also the creator God, and everyone has to be forced to worship it, and all other forms of religion have to be banned. And it seems, at least what Gemirkin is saying, that these guys in the 2nd century BC come to Alexandria, they rewrite history that depicted them as basically invaders that were kicked out of Egypt by like a populist pharaoh who saved his people. And they rewrote that, and they created this universal Yahweh that you're talking about, who is now a little bit more than just this tribal God, that he is this now. I don't know. Have you heard about this? What do you think about this?
Yeah, I've heard about I'm not sure if I read this author you mentioned. I didn't catch his name, but
Russell Gemirkin.
Yeah, I'm not sure. But anyway, I've read quite a few things about when was the Bible written, and I do think it's much younger than most people think, and I think that most historians now are moving in that direction. Traditionally we used to say that the Bible was written during the time of King in English anyway, just before the Babylonian exile, but then they say no, it was written after the Babylonian exile, in the Persian period. And then I do find evidence that in fact it was written much later. And I think one strong piece of evidence is if you look at the book of Genesis, at least the book of Genesis must be not very old, because in the book of Genesis, in the story of the Garden of Eden, what you have really, if you have a polemic against Gnostics, in fact, because the serpent of the book of Genesis speaks like a Gnostics. He says to Adam, look,
yes,
if you eat the fruit of the tree of you will know, you will have knowledge, you will know, and you will be eternal, you will be like a god. And so traditionally we used to say, well, that's what the Gnostics say, because the Gnostic read the Bible upside down, and they decided to identify with the serpent against Yahweh. But in fact, it's obviously the opposite. It's already the book of Genesis already was written against people who were proto-Gnostic, let's say. And then if you think about Gnosticism, does not really appear, especially in the Jewish world, before the first century AD, let's say. So that's, for me, a strong evidence that the book of Genesis, at least, is probably from the 1st century BC or the 1st century AD. But what I want to say, is that to me, it's not very important, because there is no conclusive, really final verdict about when the Bible was written. There are many different opinions, and that's very interesting. But finally, it doesn't really matter if our purpose is to understand what's going on today. The point is that most Jews believe it's a very old book. They believe it's the oldest book in the world, and they believe they invented, in fact, they invented the book.
Monotheism.
Hmm?
They
Yeah,
think
they
they invented
invented.
monotheism.
Yeah, they think they invented monotheism. So this to them is the sign that they are chosen, or they are special, or they are, the inventors. They invented the monotheism. So what is important to me is what they believe. Whether they believe it, whether what they believe is right or wrong, is secondary. It's interesting, of course, but. So the age of the Bible, I feel, unfortunately, there is no conclusive, evidence of the age. So, of course, it's interesting to know that there has been a constant effort from the part of the Jews to claim that they are older than Plato, they are older than Homer, they are older than anything else, because in the ancient world, antiquity or ancientness means, prestige, and so there is this tendency for them to claim that they invented, as you say, monotheism. They're very proud of it, which is a big joke. What they invented is this strange God claiming to have created the world. But the idea that the cosmos was created by God is, probably as old as mankind, or probably as old as, much older anyway.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I've never heard this thesis that the Gnostics came first. But okay, then the next question is, how does the demiurge fit into this? Because with the Gnostics, they are very clear that, like, well, I don't know. How would you, can you just give me your opinion on it? Because the traditional reading is that they looked at what was written in the Bible, especially in Genesis, and they were like, well, this God loses Adam and Eve in the garden. He seems to be not omnipotent. I'm not omniscient. Let's put it that way. And he also doesn't want them to have knowledge. He denies them the second tree, which was of eternal life. He lied to them because he said that they would die if they ate from the tree of knowledge. And the snake tells them that no, you will just have knowledge. So who was right? Well, in the very same story, God is revealed to be a liar because the snake was right. I mean, they didn't die after they ate the apple. They got cast out. So these are the arguments I've heard that the Gnostics made, and that's why they believe that he was the demiurge. What's your take on it, since you believe that there's evidence that they came first, and this was like an anti-Gnostic polemic, I guess?
Well, I have not a complete theory about Gnosticism. First of all, Gnosticism is very difficult to pinpoint to one specific doctrine. There are many different movements, and we don't know much about the Gnostic movements of the first centuries AD, because all we know about them was from their enemies. So, but I tend to think that, in fact, latest research tend to show that Gnosticism, as we understand it, not as esoterists would understand it today, but Gnosticism as the religious movements of the early centuries are originally Jewish. This is a Jewish reaction to the materialistic and gross and grotesque character of Yahweh. People who have a little bit of spirituality cannot accept that Yahweh is God. He is so grotesque, so anthropomorphic. He gets angry, he gets upset. It doesn't make any sense. So they decided that he is not the true God; he is a false God. And then his enemy, the serpent, somehow represents the true God. So Gnosticism believed that we can have access to the knowledge of God in some way. But the problem of Gnosticism is that by saying that Yahweh, they said Yahweh is an evil demiurge, but at the same time they accepted the premise that he created the world. And therefore they said, well, the world is evil. The world was created by an evil God. So this, of course, is a problem. If you follow this, and this is not definitely not consistent with Greek thought, because, basically the Greeks didn't see the world as evil. They kind of saw the cosmos as expressing the harmony of the logos or of the word of God, or whatever. So, the problem of Gnosticism, if we understand it in this way, is that they accept this ridiculous postulate that Yahweh, the God of Israel, also created the world. And therefore, they have this strong tendency to see the physical world as evil and to see salvation as, an escape from this world, which became quite dominant in the Christian tradition, because the Christian tradition is directly linked to this Gnostic tradition. So, having said that, I want to add that I think there were all kinds of different Gnostics, and we don't know much about Marcion, for example. Marcion, we don't know. We know that his brand of Christianity rejected the Old Testament, but it's not very clear if he was a real Gnostic in the sense that he rejected the physical world or not. We don't know enough about him. So, yeah, unfortunately, right. I would happily call myself agnostic in the sense that I see Yahweh as an evil God, but I would not call myself agnostic in the sense that I consider that the physical world was created by an evil God. That's the problem with Gnosticism, in my view.
I see. Yeah. Well, I'm a very I'm a very depressed guy in the sense that I'm very pessimistic. So for me, I have no problem accepting that premise. You tell me that, it would also explain in some level why the Jews appear to be in control of literally everything. You could argue that it's because of their clever way of tricking people into, accepting them as God's chosen. But you could also argue that, yeah, everything that the Bible said would happen, it seems to be happening. They do seem to be in control. And, so I don't know. I guess it depends on your temperament. But since you brought up Marcion, Marcion gets brought up periodically throughout a lot of intellectual thought in Europe. And it seems like a lot of people arrive at the conclusion that, wow, what's going on with this Yahweh character? This can't be right. And so as an example, I'll bring up two examples. The founding fathers of America, Thomas Paine, wrote this anti-Yahweh work. He wrote this, he was basically anti-Yahweh. And it seems that a lot of the founding fathers were very it's like a misconception that these guys were fundamentalist evangelicals or something. And then this comes up again in Germany, where it seems like they kind of figured out the whole Yahweh thing, and they were moving to getting rid of that. There was a movement before Nazi Germany, during Nazi Germany, where they were really thinking about what are we going to do with this? How are we going to transition out of this? So, what do you think about these historic movements that have, or intellectuals that have come around and have said, yeah, we've come to the same conclusion? What are your thoughts on that?
We're going to be cut off in 3 minutes, I fear, but so I'll try to be short, and then we'll continue later.
In part two, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I have a very ambivalent relationship to Christianity because I don't want to throw the baby with the bathwater, and I feel a lot of value in the myths of Jesus, you know, the story of Jesus and so on. But really, basically, I do think that Christianity is as much part of the problem as and more part of the problem than part of the solution. So I think the best we can hope is that the Christian world, Christendom, will move out of Christianity at some point. But how to move out of Christianity maybe is through Christianity in the way that transforming Christianity through, for example, Marcionism in some way, like realizing what the Old Testament is really about and throw it away. But it's very difficult because, you know, in many ways, the Old Testament is inside the New Testament. You know, it's full of, you know, it's very difficult to throw Yahweh away and keep the New Testament because Yahweh is in there. Even though we may say Christ has nothing to do with Yahweh, well, he's the Son of God and he's the Messiah of the Jewish people and so on. You know, there's all kinds of links between the New Testament and the Old Testament. So it's a complicated process, but I think at least moving in that direction, at least looking at what the Old Testament is really about and what it did, how it enslaved the Western world to the Jewish people in a very deep way, in a metaphysical way, you know, is a necessary step. And I do feel that Orthodox Christianity is probably much better than Roman Christianity for different reasons. And one reason is that it's more mystical, less doctrinal, and so there is more potential in Eastern Christianity to evolve toward anti-Yahwist Christianity. But that's I'm not sure about it. That's just a feeling. I don't know enough about Orthodox Christianity. I feel there are different elements.
I'd love to, in part two, to jump in and test out that thesis because I spent a lot of time sort of researching it. I was very interested in it at some point myself, but we're running up on our limits. So let's reconvene and let's keep going.
Okay.
So we left off with Russian Orthodoxy, which I think is an interesting point to bring up. I wanted to bring up a very specific example of how Orthodoxy deals with metaphysical questions. For example, in Ukraine, there are two churches. One is the canonical church, which is used to be still linked to Moscow. And it's a big deal in Orthodoxy to be canonically linked. And they got shut down. It was in the news recently by this alternative church promoted by the Ukrainian government. And so that's kind of a big deal. I mean, Kiev is a very holy city. It's historically holy. It's got these caverns or these caves, which are full of these monk cells. Lots of historic churches there. Mm-hmm. Now, it's kind of a big deal that the Orthodox Church, the canonical one, has been shut down, and all these priests are getting arrested. And you'd think that the church in Moscow would have an explanation, like metaphysically perhaps, about why this is happening. So I'd like to share with you what that is. They said, at least some of their top priests have said, that basically Yahweh is punishing the unfaithful Orthodox by using these schismatics and Zelensky. So he's punishing the guys that are getting punished right now. And so this is all part of his plan, because they were doing some shady stuff. They were cozying up to the Ukrainian government, and so now they're being punished for that. And he's using these other groups, which are worse than they are, as his instrument, his rod of chastisement.
Mm.
And that's sort of like the standard go-to. So what is the explanation for the Russian Revolution?
Mm.
Add any calamity or any bad thing that's happening, and you only have two explanations using the metaphysical model of Nicene Christianity.
Yeah.
And you can figure this out. This is just simple Boolean logic, if then, if then, if then. So if
Yeah.
God is good and God is omnipotent and he's omniscient, and it's the God of the Old Testament, right?
Mm.
And if something bad happens, how do you explain that? Well, the first explanation, there's only two. There's only two ways to get around this problem. The first solution is actually what you're seeing as evil is an optical illusion. What it really is good in disguise, in the sense that it is bringing us closer to Judgment Day.
Mm-hmm.
So really, with this explanation, it's a good thing that Lenin and Stalin killed all those Orthodox, because now there are more martyrs in heaven,
Yeah.
and that's what God needs to effect his final defeat over evil. It's like a 5D chess move. I like to use that metaphor a lot. It's God is playing chess with Satan on like a multi-dimensional level. And so though it looks like a loss or evil to us, it's actually a checkmate, or bringing us closer to checkmate against Satan. And then the other explanation is that they were sinful and they deserved it, and there was a way of punishing them.
Mm-hmm.
So God loves you, Yahweh loves you, but if you don't, do things the way he wants you to do them, if you're being sinful, he will use people that are worse than you to punish you, to show you, to bring you back to him as a
Yeah.
form of love.
Yeah.
So that's orthodoxy in a nutshell. But the redeeming, I mean, that's Nicene Christianity in a nutshell.
Yeah.
But the redeeming feature of this is that no one in orthodoxy reads the Old Testament except the priests. In fact, the priests will actively discourage you from reading it on your own, because they say it might give you some bad ideas.
Yeah.
So they only encourage reading it under a supervised type Bible study group,
Okay.
where they will give you the correct interpretation so that you don't misinterpret it.
Yeah.
And so that's pretty much what, theologically speaking, or like, that's pretty much the only thing that I would say orthodoxy has going for it over the Western systems. That plus it has some elements of like quasi-nationalism, in the sense that you have like, the Russian church, the Greek church, whatever.
Yeah.
So that's it. That's all I can say. What are your thoughts on that? Did I dispel some optimism that you might have had, or
well, I'm not that optimistic about Christianity. Just I'm trying to think about a way out. But Robespierre, the French revolutionary, who had a very interesting thought about religion. He was a very religious man. I don't want to get too much into his life, but it's very interesting. But he thought, his religion was what he called natural religion. Like, let's believe in God, let's believe in life after death, and then the rest is not important. Everybody can believe what they want, but at least let's affirm, the existence of a creator and the survival of the soul, of the human soul. And he saw Christianity, he saw very clearly the problems of Christianity, but he also understood that you cannot pull people out of Christianity like this. People will naturally move out of it. So I tend to think like this, but so I tend to think that it's a very complicated process, because Christianity is dead in France, for example, almost dead, and but there's nothing to replace it. So it's a complicated process. The reason I felt that there's something better in Orthodox Christianity, of course, I understand that Orthodox priests speak the same nonsense as Roman priests, basically. For example, you mentioned, this kind of paradoxical way that God has to allow evil to punish, evildoers and this kind of thing. But this is at the root of Christianity. Even if you think about Jesus himself, look, God is supposed to have prepared the Jewish people to welcome the Messiah, but somehow he needed the Jewish people to crucify the Messiah, because if the Messiah doesn't get crucified, he will not get resurrected. And, this whole thing is just doesn't make any sense at all. So, this is the same in Orthodox Christianity as in Roman Christianity. But there are different reasons why I feel, at least, Orthodox Christianity is at the moment maybe still a good force, a force for good, for civilization, at least in Russia, which it is not anymore in the Western world. And one reason, as you mentioned, is because at least it's a national church. So Orthodox Christianity contributes to create a patriotic feeling, which Roman Catholicism can never do. Look, the Pope, he's supposed to reside in Rome. He's from Latin America. There is nothing national about it at all. How can Roman Catholicism, for example, help the people in France to feel proud of their nation? There's no way. So Orthodox Christianity always recognized the national identity and allowed, for example, the liturgy to be in Russian or the Slavic language, whereas Roman Catholicism imposed the Latin language everywhere in the world. That's already one aspect. And another aspect which there's different thing. Another thing which is very important, I think, is look at what I would call the karma. What Roman Catholicism did in the world throughout history is a lot of evil. And, if you look at Orthodox Christianity, Orthodox Christians never went on crusades. They hardly burnt any heretics. They didn't set up an inquisition. The whole, their profile as a historical force is much cleaner. Roman Catholicism has accumulated so many crimes, and especially in the way it destroyed Orthodox Christianity. In fact, this very intense conflict between Rome and Constantinople has been dominating all the Middle Ages, and finally Rome is responsible for the destruction of the Byzantine civilization. And Russia is the heir, the inheritor of Byzantine civilization in some ways. So for that reason also, I feel there is something more purer. And if you think in terms of egregores, you mentioned egregore. If you think of Christianity as some kind of spiritual force, then Orthodox Christianity can at least appear as a spiritual force for good, because of what it did in the past. Whereas Roman Catholicism, it has so many crimes on its record. And another thing that I tend to think is that Orthodox Christianity invests more into the aesthetic. So it recognizes that one way to God is not only through what you believe, not only through doctrine, but also through, beauty, the beauty of song, the beauty of icons. And that's because doctrine is a problem in Christianity. I'm sorry, but people will not anymore believe that Jesus was born of a virgin and came out of his tomb. This is finished. It's over. You cannot resurrect the creed, as a literal truth. So in Orthodox Christianity, that's my feeling. Maybe I'm wrong, but literal truth is less important. So there is a way out, and I would feel, for me, who is a rational being and who cannot believe that Jesus was born of a virgin and resurrected physically, it would be easier for me to feel Christian in the Orthodox tradition, because first of all, I would not have to recite the credo. When you go to a Roman Catholic church, you have to recite the credo. That means you have to say, I believe Jesus was born of a virgin, resurrected out of his tomb, and so on. You have to declare that before God. And I cannot do this because I don't believe it. I don't want to lie. And it seems to me that in the Orthodox, I can go in an Orthodox church and I don't have to be bothered with that. I can feel, try to connect to God in different ways,
Well, you're definitely supposed to believe that, but no one's going to get up in your face about that. You just sort of waltz in, light some candles. If you want, you can get blessed. And it's very hands off. I'd put it that way. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
you also mentioned mysticism. Orthodox Christianity did used to have an actual living spiritual discipline, very well hidden, very well tucked away. But there was an interesting increase in interest in it in the 19th and early 20th centuries because of the Philokalia, the Dobrotolubie. It's this mystical book. It's called the Mystical Bible, and it's basically the sayings or the teachings of the elders of Mount Athos in
Hmm.
Greece.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that the Russian translation, which made its way over, says is explicitly anti, like it says, do not do this at home. Whereas the Greek version is like, hey, do it at home, try it for yourself. And the Orthodox, I don't like, I understand your points, and generally, I guess I agree. But there are these little problems. Let's forget about the doctrine, which is identical for the most part.
Mm.
But there are some problems. For example, did you know that the Orthodox Church supported the overthrow of the Tsar? This is a
Mm.
little fact that people don't know. They sided with Kerensky, which was the February Revolution.
Mm.
And their logic was really simple. Like, if we get rid of the Tsar, the people will have to rely more on the church. So that worked out well for them.
Yeah, I didn't know
Then
that,
you all,
but what I know is that they actually sanctified the Tsar later, so they
yes,
can at least, that creates a strong connection between Orthodox Christianity and patriotic spirit. They made a saint, almost a saint, out of him and his family, didn't they?
yes. In fact, there's a church in Moscow,
Yeah.
which is a favorite among nationalists. It's right next to the American embassy,
Mhm.
and it's got like the white army, not the white army, the Imperial Army crest and everything, and they have this exhibition where they basically blame the Jews for ritually murdering him and writing in Yiddish on the walls as like a blood curse or something.
Mm.
So they're pretty cool on that.
Okay.
But that's but allow me to list a few more of the crimes of the
Yeah.
Orthodox.
Okay.
Another
Yeah.
problem is that so this tradition of the Hezekiahs and Mount Athos. Did you know that under the Turks, these people were left alone, which is remarkable, actually.
Mm.
They were let to do their own thing, but the Russians launched an expedition. The church pursued an expedition, and they basically murdered like 1,000 of these monks and sent them to Siberia, and they banned them from ever even receiving communion. So
Mm.
that's kind of like really, really bad. And if you're a believer,
You're talking
and
about
there's
the
this,
old believers? Is that what you're?
no.
No,
This is
no.
20th century,
20th
20th century,
century.
like,
Oh, okay.
yeah,
Yeah, I know.
19, like right before the revolution, they sent an expedition of drunk sailors to sack Mount Athos,
Oh,
which
okay.
is another sordid
Mm.
chapter in it's like a mini version of the Inquisition, I guess you
Yeah.
could say.
Okay. Mm.
The old believer stuff is interesting as well. That is like the closest that the Orthodox went to
Mm.
kind of like a Cathar type
Yeah.
Inquisition purge.
Yeah.
But the old believers now are allowed to come back into the church. They've made a
Oh,
deal, a compromise. And
okay.
finally, the biggest problem is the legacy of the KGB church.
Mm.
Uh, and so, technically speaking, Orthodox don't like to, well, they won't like to hear any of this, but technically speaking, there is no continuity because of the communist period and the fact that basically the church was a front and a lot of the priests were informers. So if anyone gave confession, they would rat them out to the KGB.
Mm.
And there's a lot of people. That's why there's this schismatic movement within Russia where they basically accuse them of still being sort of tied in with this sort of thing, and lots of but whatever. I mean, that's just
Yeah. Yeah.
just some details. I figured I'd share it.
Yeah.
But with the mysticism part, Orthodoxy does have a sliver of it,
Mm.
and it's in the Hezekiah tradition, which is basically like Christian yoga or Christian Zen.
Yeah.
The best they hate it when I compare it to that, but that's exactly what it is. I mean, it even translates like Satori or Nirvana is basically the equivalent of hesychasm, which means internal
Yeah.
silence. And
Yeah.
so what they would do was they would do these special practices, breathing techniques, special positions, mudras with their hands and stuff. and they laid it all out, and they have this practice where you're trying to become Christ. It was a mystical thing.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
go through a process of like developing spiritual skills, like what you would think a yogi would do or something.
Yeah.
So you do have that a little bit in Orthodoxy. And I think that if you are to have a religion, I'm sorry, but you need to have like a magical part to it. Otherwise, it's like, political ideology does just fine.
Yeah.
Nationalism does just fine. Even communism can work if you don't have this. In
Yeah.
theory, you read the Bible and it's about people walking on water and turning water into wine. It's like, and
Yeah.
everyone accepts that. But then you're like, yeah, well, why don't you meditate and reach a higher level of spiritual being? And they're like, whoa, that's crazy talk. You
Yeah.
believe that a person walked on water? Who's the crazy one here?
Yeah.
So I would agree that there is something within Orthodox Christianity that
Yeah.
retains elements of the mystical, and it actually inspired a lot of mysticism that we see, like Gurdjieff, for example. Maybe you've heard of him,
Yeah.
or
Sure. Yeah. Yeah,
so that.
that's one important point to me. At least I feel there's more space for people who are heterodox, to at least feel connected to the Orthodox Christianity. And I don't know, you will tell me if I'm wrong, but I have a feeling that most Russian writers, for example, thought of themselves as Christians. Of course, from the point of view of the priests, they were heretics. If you think about Tolstoy or even Dostoevsky. And
Yes.
there's one theologian, one kind of philosopher and poet I like is Vladimir Soloviev. So when I mention Vladimir Soloviev to some Orthodox Christian, they say, "Oh, he's a heretic." But the fact is, maybe he's a heretic, but in fact, he's still in the eyes of Russian intellectuals, he still represents one aspect of Orthodox Christianity. So I feel there's less tension, hostility, and aggressivity between orthodoxy and heterodoxy. It's a guy like Soloviev can feel a Christian, an Orthodox Christian, even though his thinking is totally special.
I
So
agree. I agree.
so
There's something to that.
they don't burn heretics generally. They would condemn them, they would disagree, but still they let them live, they let them write, they let them express their own mystical Christianity. And so it's, I think, easier for an intellectual who feels religiously, attracted by religion, to feel at ease, to feel at home in the Orthodox Christianity. And another point I wanted to emphasize, I think it's very important, is that, there's a very big problem in Roman Catholicism with the celibacy of the priest. It's a really
Right.
big problem. Now they have to recruit priests in Africa, here, just like football players, because nobody wants to live the celibate life of a priest. And those who do, there's a lot of also things about,
Right.
so at least in Orthodox Christianity, the priests are basically generally married. Of course, the patriarch is supposed to be a monk and so on. I understand this, but at least married life has a place, and I think that makes a huge difference from the point of view of the life of Christians in general, from the point of view of the image of the family, within Christianity and so on. Because
They
Roman
also support
Catholicism,
the military. Oh, sorry. They
yeah,
also support
yeah,
the military. So
yeah,
you see them blessing soldiers and weapons and banners and stuff. People like
yeah,
that.
yeah,
There's also this war cathedral that was constructed, which is a bizarre thing.
yeah.
I'll send you a video of it. I think it's really cool. It looks very aesthetic. But it's a little bit bizarre because they mix communist imagery with Orthodox Christian imagery,
Mhm.
which
Yeah.
I mean, that's how history works. It's like
Yeah, I saw
things
that.
that.
I saw that. Yeah. Well, for me, the main question is how to rebuild civilization, with moral values and so on. So, if and also including patriotism, because patriotism means valuing the community more than your own life and so on. So, Orthodox Christianity at this moment maybe is contributing to that positively. I'm not sure it has a real
Yeah.
future, because I'm not sure that Russians will, they don't really go to church, I heard. Putin built
No.
all these beautiful churches everywhere, but people don't go there so much. So I'm not sure if it really has a future. I don't know. I doubt it.
Well, yeah, Russians are culturally Christian, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
They will sort of celebrate some of the holidays, but it's actually a funny distinction. Usually, it's the older generation that's anti-Christian in the sense that they don't. So, for example, when Easter comes around, a lot of people from the newer generation will say, Christ is risen, and you're supposed to reply, indeed, he is risen. Whereas the older generation, as a way of signaling, they'll say, Happy Easter or Happy Holiday,
Right.
and they won't reply with the. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's I think the best estimate of how many people attend church in Russia has put it at about like 10, 11, 12%.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
but yeah, but at the same time, I think there is a lot of interest in finding something genuine, reconnecting to the spiritual. And I
Mm-hmm.
know you've given that some thought. You've thought about how to do that. And you've hinted at, for example, like a collective unconsciousness, a racial soul, perhaps, or an ethnic soul. And you've mentioned Jung, and you've mentioned Sheldrake. And can I share a little story about Sheldrake with you?
Sure, sure. I'm very interested in Sheldrake. Yeah.
So I reached out to Sheldrake and I had a very cordial conversation with him. It was very cool of him to reply to me. And I had read his books and I was also really interested. And he was talking about, for example, like some rats in some lab in America will be exposed to some poison. And then some labs in London who had no contact with the rats in America will learn somehow that this is poison, and they quickly adapt to different kinds of poisons, which is why every year manufacturers have to make different varieties of rat poison.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you explain this? You can't explain this through genetic mutation, Darwinian selection, or anything like that. And so Sheldrake says, well, these species probably share like a cloud server, like an information bank somewhere up there, and
Exactly.
this
Yeah.
information from one group is uploaded and then this other group downloads it. And so I was fascinated, but then I reach out to him and I say, listen, this morphic resonance that you're talking about, it if applies to groups of rats, is it possible it could apply to groups of humans? Is it possible that perhaps French people have a greater morphic resonance with each other than, say, like a Chinese person with an African person? Is it possible? And he was like, yeah, of course, it follows logically. And the reason why he attends an Anglican church in England, it's not because he believes in it. It's because he wants to be in morphic resonance with the Anglo-Saxon soul. That's what he says in his books.
Yeah.
So I ask him, okay, so in that case, what you're saying is that people of the same ethnos and people who live in the same country or have the same culture, shouldn't they have like a similar situation going on? And he said, yes, but it is politically impossible to talk about this. It's Nazism. Sorry. So he was quite
Exactly.
honest about that.
Yeah. That's the problem. Yeah. It's yeah. I understand very well. Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting.
But you think he's onto something with that, yeah?
Oh, sure, sure. Yeah. I think what you mentioned, that's the logical conclusion of his theory, that there is a group souls of we are connected genetically to our ancestors, where and to all the people who share the same ancestors. This is absolutely natural. And in fact, I believe one of the main problem of Christianity, and especially Latin Christianity, is to have destroyed this ancestral bond. And this is stronger in Latin Christianity, and it's connected to the fact that priests are celibate. Roman Christianity, you have to think of it as it was basically born in the 11th century. Before that, there was no split between the two traditions, and it was a monkish coup. The Roman Christianity was taken over by monks, who monks, by definition, they reject, their genetic heritage. They reject their name. They change their name. They don't have parents anymore. They don't have children, of course, and so the whole tradition became very hostile well, this is within Christianity itself from the beginning to some degree, but much more in Latin Christianity. And I heard, for example, in Serbian tradition, Serbian Orthodox tradition, they still have some kind of ancestor worship ritual, some kind of, some kind of ways to connect to their ancestors, through the ritual of what it calls I forgot the name of it.
I know what you're talking about. I've done it. They have it in Ukraine as well.
Yeah.
You go to the graves of your ancestors and you pour out some, you leave them some candy and you leave them some drinks,
Yeah.
alcoholic usually, which I think if you like, if you study, for example, the Roman world or the Greeks, they believe that yes, the spirits of the ancestors sort of like ghosts. They live on, like their soul moves on, but there's a part of them that's still, perhaps the etheric elements, the etheric soul that's still around, and they need our help. They need like us to think about them. They need us to honor them, and if
Yeah.
you don't, if you neglect them, if you do not, if you neglect them, basically, they go from being benign spirits that help you out to being these evil spirits that torment you. And
Yeah.
that's the difference between geniuses. That's where we get the word genius, because it's like inspiration from these daemons, right? Daemons used to be good, or at least kind of neutral. Then they became demons, and they became evil in Christianity. But so geniuses or geniuses are the good ones, and then if you neglect them, they become Lars or larves, which are like these malignant. Maybe that's why everything's so bad nowadays, because our
Yeah.
ancestors are angry at us
Yeah.
in China.
As I said, I believe one of the most important thing in religion is to believe that your soul lives after death and your ancestors live after death. At least for some time. I mean, even though the minimum creed is this for me. That's part of natural religion. People have always believed that the human spirit is immortal in some way. So connection with ancestors has always been the basis of all religious tradition, and Christianity is hostile by nature to this, and that's for me the biggest problem. But maybe there's some way within Orthodox Christianity to keep at least some space for some kind of ancestor worship. That means some kinds of I feel to fight against individualism. The only way is not, you cannot connect people to directly to their nation, or you have to rebuild the connection to their ancestors, create a sense of a vertical sense of lineage, to make people feel they are part of a lineage. What they are is what their ancestors gave them, and they have also a responsibility to give life, because they receive, they have to give. This kind of a feeling which I cultivate in myself. This is basically my religion, and this is, I feel very healthy, very healing, because everybody has a lot of problems. Everybody suffered. Everybody had parents who were not perfect, and but if you try to think of yourself as part of a long story, your life is very short, but it's part of a very long story that goes back very far, as far as you can imagine, and will continue through your descendants. And connecting the sense of the spiritual world, souls of your ancestors are alive, but also connecting that to the sense that life is transmitted. And that's where the genetic, you talked about Rupert Sheldrake and his whole view of the genetic dimension of man, I feel is very interesting, because he sees this genetic reality as not material, but as profoundly spiritual. Genes are, in his theory, genes are more like antenna. They are connected to a reality which is belonging to another world, and we are passing on not just physical codes, but all kinds of spiritual things. So I feel this is the thing that that's why I love Rupert Sheldrake too, because I feel this is something This is what connects. This is both a scientific approach to something deeply religious, and this is a way to reconnect, our materialistic culture to our spiritual culture. And I think we'll have to
Yeah.
stop soon because I've got a message that we're going to be cut off soon.
It looks like we got 7 minutes left in this
Okay.
session.
Oh yeah.
Could
So
I jump in here with this? So, but in terms of this connection to ancestors, I think you're right. It is a very fundamental part of the religious experience. This idea that you are the continue. I was very lucky in that my dad, who I don't know where he got it from, but he had this thinking in him as well, and he always taught me that from a young age. And lo and behold, his son grew up to be a hated nationalist slash racist, like enemy of society, because that kind of thinking was so deeply imprinted onto me, and I can't imagine that there are actually people in this world who appear to be the majority of our countries who don't understand that, who don't believe it, who don't feel it. Um, but yeah, I think that's a really important point to make in terms of reconnecting people to this sort of thing. Uh, there has to again, I want to stress that like a lot of this talk about religion and everything, it's being conducted by people who are fundamentally like materialists, in the sense that they're not religious they're not, they don't I think that there is an empirical way to go about discussing spiritualism. And I have this series where I talk about what I call empirical mysticism. A lot of it can be explained through science. I mean, a lot of these effects, these altered states of awareness and everything, it's biochemistry. It can be induced by machines. It can be measured. It can be it's
yeah,
present in a lot of different traditions. And the funny thing is we're in between a rock and a hard place where
yeah,
in some sense society rejected a lot of this stuff that we're against, like this dogma, a lot of this absurd theological nonsense,
mhm,
but they rejected it, and the rebellion was based around materialism. They were like, well, we don't need that, we have factories now, or we
yeah,
have technology
yeah,
now.
yeah.
And so now
Well,
you're
actually,
you
sorry. Yeah, go on.
you're just now we're between a rock and a hard place where
Mhm,
if you are against, a lot of atheists did read the Bible, or they were like what is going on here? They rejected it, but they threw the baby out with the bathwater, and they became, whereas, and the funny thing is when I talk about mysticism or spirituality, I find that the people who are most open to talking to this about with me are not Christians. It's atheists who
yeah,
but the Christians will reject it immediately. What is your experience with that? Who is most
yeah.
open to these ideas, in your opinion?
Oh, I agree. I've always been very disappointed with Christians in general, because Christians feel more comfortable to talk with atheists than with people who have religious ideas which don't really fit. Anyway,
Right.
I've always been very disappointed. I avoid now discussing with Christians, and I tend to think, if you really think about it, as you said, people threw away the baby with the bathwater, and that's because, in fact, in some way, atheism is a result of Christianity. I mean, atheism could never have happened in any other tradition than Christendom. It's because people felt they have to reject this Yahweh thing and this dogma you have to believe. If you don't believe, so they rejected this, and then they found themselves without anything left. And that's the tragedy of Christianity. Christianity led directly to atheism in some way. If you think about the Greek tradition, pre-Christian Greek tradition, I mean, atheism would not make any sense at all in this tradition, because philosophy itself is a way to search for the deeper metaphysical truth. So, you have all kinds of ways to think about God. God itself is a concept that you can make whatever you want with it. You don't have to throw it away. But within Christianity, we are taught that God is this crazy character who, in the Old Testament, so people wanted to throw it away. So they threw away God. They didn't know that Yahweh was not was just a grotesque, image of God. So you see what I mean? So this is a
Oh
tragedy
yeah.
of Christianity in some way. And what I wanted to forgot what I wanted to say. Yeah, no, I forgot.
Well, it's just I want to back up your point. The thing is that whenever you see so many rebellions against sort of mainstream Christianity, but each one makes it worse than the situation was before it in a weird way. Like take Protestantism, for example. So, Roman Catholicism is quite clearly just like a political project. It's a global theocratic mission, and its primary objective in the beginning, I think, was to undermine German nationalism. That seems to be the whole point of it. It's to turn Germans against one another and to make sure that they never unify, and so dividing and conquering them. And so you have this rejection by a lot of countries that are not happy sending tribute to Rome, basically, but they do it by reverting to an even worse form of Christianity brought about by Martin Luther learning Hebrew, basically, and speaking with Jews and them being like, yeah, all this stuff that you guys do, you totally made it up. It's not in the Bible. And he's like, you're right. All this stuff about the saints and Mary, well, this is all made up stuff. And the German princes, they took this and they said, okay, now we have a theological reason to rebel against Rome. And they ended up with an even worse version of Christianity, I would say, with the only saving thing being that at least there are national churches.
Yeah. That's a tragedy. Yeah. And as you said, I think, reconnecting science. I really encourage people to read Rupert Sheldrake. It's really very inspiring, and reconnecting. Trying to start again from this kind of realization that there are mysteries. Life is mysterious. There's full of supernatural realities. And from that we can build up a new.
All right, then. Well, we will have to reconvene then. Thank you so much for talking to me. This was great. Until next time, then.
Okay, thank you, Rolo.